Folks, what are the successes of communism? There aren't supposed to be any. If you talk to liberals, you talk to conservatives, you talk to standard American political commentators, there are not supposed to be any successes associated with communism. I heard it my whole life. Communism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. Communism never accomplished anything. There's a PragerU video which claims that everywhere Marxists have come to power, they, quote, made life worse. But folks, what are the successes of communism? The successes of communism are all around us. It was communism that took Russia from being a backward, agrarian, feudal country with mass illiteracy and very little industrialization into being a global industrial superpower. It was socialism that electrified Russia. It was socialism that provided running water to every household in Russia. It was socialism that wiped out illiteracy in Russia. It was socialism that defeated the Nazi invaders and gave the most lives in the effort to defeat fascism during the Second World War. It was socialism that launched the first spacecraft. It was socialism that launched the first person into outer space. It was socialism that created the world's first LED lights. It was socialism that created the world's first mobile phone. It was socialism that took China from being the sick man of Asia, one of the poorest countries in the world, and made it what it is today, the second largest economy on earth. It was socialism and a state centrally planned economy that created the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, Huawei Technologies, which is so good at making phones that are so much better than iPhones and the phones of Samsung and the phones of American corporations, that our government is in the process of trying to prevent people from buying them, trying to suppress with sanctions and threats and twist the arm of the world out of buying their phones. It was socialism that built the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant. That hydroelectrical power plant is the Three Gorges Dam in China. It was socialism that raised 800 million people in China out of poverty. It was socialism in Libya under the leadership of Muammar Gaddafi that built the world's largest irrigation system, the Great Man-Made River. It's socialism that created Cuba's healthcare system, which is widely admired all over the world. Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General, said that Cuba's medical school was probably one of the greatest in the world. You can look up the quotes that Ban Ki-moon said about Cuba's medical school that they constructed. It was socialism that built the largest hydroelectrical power plant in the whole Middle East, the Aswan Dam, and brought electricity to Egypt until Abdel Nasser, the Arab socialist leader, and Khrushchev and the Soviet Union teamed up to build that dam. Much of Egypt did not have electricity. It was socialism that electrified Egypt. It was socialism that electrified Syria, and agreements with the Soviet Union. All kinds of hydroelectrical power plants were built in Syria. It was socialism that raised millions out of poverty in Nicaragua and wiped out illiteracy in Nicaragua. You can read about their achievements. The World Happiness Index has praised Nicaragua and the Sandinista government for their accomplishments. Prior to the recent coup in Bolivia, we saw Bolivia have the highest rate of GDP growth of any Latin American and South American country. Their GDP growth was astounding. People were rising out of poverty. Roads were being paved. Illiteracy had been wiped out. Huge achievements were taking place. Socialism has achieved quite a bit. This constant bombardment that we get, that socialism has never accomplished anything anywhere, nowhere has it ever worked, is malarkey. It's obvious malarkey. It's so obviously false that the only reason people say it is because they hear it over and over and over again. The achievements of socialism are massive, but we should not limit socialism's achievements simply to countries where socialist economics has been implemented. Because the socialist and communist movement have achieved tremendous things outside of the countries where they hold power. For example, the civil rights movement. In the 1930s, nobody knew who Martin Luther King was. He was a small child. But the Communist Party led the fight for the Scottsboro Nine. It called for civil rights. It nominated James W. Ford, a black man, as its vice presidential candidate 3 times. It called for equal rights for African Americans. It was a big supporter of the Harlem Renaissance. African American writers like Richard Wright and Langston Hughes proudly associated themselves with the Communist Party, because no other organization, no other political party did more to fight for the equality of African Americans during that time. I mean, you can talk about the achievements in terms of the labor movement. The fact that, people working auto plants, steel mills, meat packing centers, meat packing houses, made poverty wages. Working class people from Eastern Europe, working class people from Italy, working class people from Ireland, African American folks who moved up north, they made poverty wages in American industries until the Communist Party built the CIO, the Congress for Industrial Organizations. Right? The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was the big labor union at the time, and it had a policy of not organizing into unions anyone who did a quote-unquote unskilled job. If you were a factory worker, if you were not a craftsman, you could not be part of the AFL. And furthermore, the AFL was pretty openly racist. Many of the crafts and guilds of the AFL were whites only. So, it started out with John L. Lewis from the Miners Union, but there was a breakaway from the AFL, and the Communist Party poured in and supplied thousands and thousands and thousands of its members to be organizers for the Congress for Industrial Organizations, the CIO. And the CIO was the radical alternative to the AFL. It was open to anyone. It barred racism. It was organizing industrial workers, the CIO. And the CIO exploded in 1936 and 1937. All over the country, people in industrial jobs began unionizing. And of course, the bosses would respond by shooting them and beating them and gassing them, having the police arrest them. And it was the CIO that developed the tactic of sit-down strikes, where the workers would not simply protest outside with picket signs, but they would occupy their factories. They would sit down. It was a sit-down strike. 1937, you had an event called the Flint sit-down strike, where auto workers that were part of the Communist Party, mainly part of the Communist Party, some were in the Socialist Workers' Party, some were in the Proletarian Party, a very small party that existed in Michigan at that time. They occupied their factory, demanding the right to union representation on the job. And of course, the local police were sent in to attack them. So they fought the police off with wrenches and screws and tools. It was called the Battle of Bull's Run. They called policemen bulls. And in 1937, when the police were sent to try and clear the auto workers from their plant, they beat the police back by throwing wrenches and screws and nails at the police. It was called the Battle of Bull's Run because the police ran away. In fact, there was even a moment where they turned the fire hoses onto the police and knocked them over with fire hoses. We hear about police knocking over protesters in the civil rights movement later with fire hoses, but they don't tell us about the day when communist auto workers turned fire hoses on the police to protect their occupation of their factory in Flint, Michigan. They don't tell us about that. They don't tell us about how President Roosevelt sent the U.S. Army to Flint, Michigan, and everyone expected that the military was going to come in and clear out the striking workers and destroy them. That often happened when there was a strike. The National Guard would be sent in to gun down the striking workers. But because Roosevelt had an alliance with the Communist Party, he favored an alliance with the Soviet Union, the military came to Flint and they turned their machine gun away from the factory to protect the striking workers from the local police and from the Black Legion, which was a fascist group. That's the group that killed the father of Malcolm X in Michigan. The Black Legion was a Ku Klux Klan type organization. And when the military was sent to protect the striking workers, at that point, General Motors had no alternative. And they signed a union contract and allowed the workers at General Motors to be a part of a union. And when the auto workers at Flint, Michigan marched out of their plant victorious, it was the single black worker in the plant who got to carry the American flag. And that was to make a statement. There was only one black worker employed at the factory in Flint, Michigan, because of racism, right? Racism in hiring. And he was employed at the plant. He didn't work on the line. He was a janitor, But they made a point of when they marched out of the plant victorious with their wives and kids and all kinds of people cheering them and supporting them, and they marched out of that plant to have the only black worker in the auto plant carry the American flag, to make a statement that what made the CIO, the Congress for Industrial Organizations, what made the Communist Party, what made the workers' labor movement strong was that it rejected any form of racial bigotry. It said an injury to one is an injury to all. Very powerful. Very, very powerful. Right? The story goes that before the military was sent to Flint, Michigan, John L. Lewis, the leader of the miners' union, who was from West Virginia, he came to Flint, Michigan. He got there. He stood in front of the factory that was occupied by the General Motors workers, and he ripped open his shirt. And he said, if they're going to shoot anybody, they got to shoot me. And he was a big man, a coal miner. And he was the leader of one of the biggest labor unions in the country. And he said, if they're going to take down these auto workers, they're going to attack these auto workers that occupied their factory, why they are going to have to attack and take down the leader of the miners' union. Solidarity. Solidarity. And of course, the victory at the Flint sit-down strike made an explosion of sit-down strikes all over the country. Workers occupied their factories, refused to leave until their demands were met, all over the country, everywhere. And that's what built those strong unions, those strong industrial unions that made it so those good-paying jobs that everyone talks about, those good-paying industrial jobs that everyone says, went overseas, the American dream after the Second World War, it was communists who built it. There wouldn't have been a Motor City in Detroit if it weren't for the communists. There wouldn't have been a good-paying layer of industrial workers in the United States if it weren't for the communists. These are the strengths and the achievements of communism. You can go down the line. Many, many tremendous achievements have been carried out by communists. Women's right to vote, for goodness sakes. Susan B. Anthony, the leader of the struggle to win women's right to vote, very famously said to Eugene V. Debs, she said, if you give us suffrage, we will give you socialism. To which Eugene V. Debs replied, if you can give us socialism, we will give you suffrage. The struggle for a woman's right to vote and the struggle to build socialism were one in the same. It was communists who were very key in getting the gay rights and the LGBT rights movement going. Read about Harry Hay, the Mattachine Society, Bachelors for Wallace. The achievements of communists are massive. There's something about those achievements. The only reason I have to list them here is because no one's ever told you about them. I want to get to a bigger point than that. A lot of you watching already know about these achievements, but because people don't know about them, I'm forced to go over them and reiterate the point because no one ever acknowledges the achievements of communism. No one ever acknowledges the achievements of communists and Marxists and socialists. No one ever acknowledges these tremendous contributions to humanity. No one ever acknowledges this. So I'm forced to go over them point by point. We've all been told that socialism never accomplished anything, never achieved anything, never did anything good happen from it. And that's such a lie. That's so easily dissected. But I have to keep repeating it, because if I don't repeat it, someone will watch this live who doesn't know about these achievements and say, what is he talking about? What achievements? No one knows about these things. And as I've often emphasized on these lives, you can never assume that anybody knows anything, especially about the stuff we talk about on here, because I can guarantee you most people do not know about it. There have been tremendous achievements achieved by communists and socialists and revolutionaries. But I want to point toward a specific aspect of those achievements. That's what I'm here to talk about. My point is not that these achievements were made. I want to bring your attention to a certain aspect of these achievements, which is very, very, very important for the presentation I'm making tonight. I'll tell you one last achievement to make this point. I've told this story before. When I was in elementary school, I was a child, my family hosted a foreign student from Bulgaria. He was in his 20s, he was attending a nearby college, and it was, they had a program where a local family would host a foreign student. So we hosted this student from Bulgaria. Now, he wasn't a communist. Was not a communist. Definitely not a communist. But he had grown up under communism in Bulgaria. He had negative things to say about the Communist Party and the Soviet Union and such. But at one point I did ask him as a child, why did people support the communists in Bulgaria? Or I think I said to him, did anybody support the communists in Bulgaria? And he looked surprised that I would even ask that question. He said, my grandfather was a huge supporter of the communists. And I asked, why? Why was he so supportive of the communists? And he proceeded to tell me a story that stuck with me, that couldn't get out of my head. He told me that after the Second World War, when the Communist Party, the Marxists, came to power in Bulgaria, the country had no paved roads. Bulgaria and Eastern Europe was underdeveloped. It had no paved roads, or very little paved roads. And so his grandfather and all the young men joined together and were organized by the communists to build roads in Bulgaria. And they would go from town to town, from city to city, laying the pavement for Bulgaria's roads. And that his grandfather remembered this as the most glowing experience of his life. How they would go from town to town, from village to village, thousands of young men laying pavement. And they were treated as heroes when they would arrive in a new village. Everyone would applaud for them. These are the youth, the future of the nation. And they're working hard in the hot sun. They're sweating. But they're doing it so that our nation, Bulgaria, can have roads. And it was a moment in which it seemed that the whole country was coming together. People weren't building roads for their own self-interest. They weren't building roads so that they could become a rags-to-riches millionaire and be on MTV. They were building roads because they felt like they were part of a community, like they had a historic duty. They had something to achieve. And he said that his grandfather, decades and decades later, was always the most loyal supporter of the communists in Bulgaria because of that experience of being a young man and helping his impoverished, poor Eastern European country build paved roads. That's what it was. And if you look at the history of communism around the world, these are the kinds of things that people loved the communists for. The 5-year plans. Read about the 5-year plans.
Ella Shishtia was one of a new generation of women.
Когда Ленин сказал, стране нужна электрификация, а коммунизм это советская...
When Lenin said that communism is Soviet power plus electrification, I decided that I should become an electrical engineer, that was my holy duty. And I didn't want to just draw up plans. I wanted to build an electric power station. That was my mission, and I achieved it. The revolution gave me the right to feel equal to any man. It gave me the right to work, to study what I wanted to study.
Она давала мне право трудиться, учиться так, как я хочу.
Fyodorova was held up as an example to others.
We live so well. Our hearts are so joyful. In no other country are there such happy young people as us. We're the happiest young people. And on behalf of all young people, I want to thank our party and our dear comrade Stalin for this joy that we have.
Stalin set a task. Build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible at one of the most difficult times to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. Because for us, Stalin was an idol.
Teams of young activists were sent to the country.
Мы, значит, ходили, молодежь, переписали всех неграмотных, просто из дома.
We went from house to house in search of illiterate people. We made a note of their names.
Потом, значит, составляли списки.
We then found suitable rooms to hold classes in.
И проводили занятия.
Learning to write would open new doors for those trapped at the bottom of society. One woman who couldn't attend classes because of her child at home was helped by Anastasia Denisova.
Я сказала, что вот тебе учебник, вот будешь заниматься.
I said, here's a textbook for you. I'll come to you so you can learn to read at home. I remember vividly that when the baby cried, she carried on writing with one hand while she rocked him with the other. She was so keen to study. I'll always remember her striving for knowledge and enlightenment. It was immense.
Просто-напросто была огромная.
For Valentina Mikova and Mikhail Arkhipov, these were the most fulfilling days of their lives.
На строительстве домен был один экскаватор. И то плохой.
There was one excavator at the blast furnace building site, and it wasn't always reliable. So we dug all the foundations by hand.
Понимаете, копошатся люди.
The trench would be teeming with people. One takes the earth, throws it to the level above. The second person throws it to the third to the fourth, up to 5 or 6 levels. That was how we got the earth out of the trench. Then it was taken away in wheelbarrows.
How, millions and millions of rural villages were turned into modern housing, with construction sites and running water and electricity. The population was just mobilized to build. A spirit of selflessness was created. In China, they did the same thing. Mass construction projects. It was socialism that created the steel industry. And, all kinds of things were done. Just huge efforts to raise people out of poverty, mobilizing the people, building a spirit of selflessness and community. That's what makes communists powerful. That's what communists have always been loved for, is that ability to achieve something, a state of mind in which people feel like they are part of something bigger than themselves. They go beyond their own ego and they become part of a bigger collective. They get into an alternative state of consciousness where they can work together to construct big things. That is the strength of socialism. And One can experience that not even in countries where socialism is the ruling party, but in the socialist and communist movement itself. Right? I talked about the Flint sit-down strike. Did they not have a spirit of camaraderie and brotherhood and sisterhood and bravery when they stood arm in arm and occupied their factory? Folks, I've told the story before of the elderly man that I knew who used to wear a baseball cap with Palestine on it. And he was Jewish, and he lived in New York City, and he would walk through the streets wearing his Palestine baseball cap, and every time you saw him, you heard nothing but positiveness. You know he got negativity for that. That's not something that's going to make you popular in New York City. But whenever you saw him, he just told you, there was a group of teenagers the other day, they gave me a thumbs up, Caleb. They thought it was great I was wearing the Palestine hat. That's the kind of thing he said to me. And this man would spend his days, he was retired, going around to newsstands across the city, making sure that they had the communist newspaper available. Right? And it was that kind of cultivated happiness, that belief that he's part of a project. It was that belief that he was part of something bigger than himself. He was part of a bigger project. That's what really inspired this man to keep going. That's what his life was about. He was a communist because it gave him a reason to be. It gave him a reason to live. It gave him a higher purpose to strive for and to fight for. I felt that way as I worked tirelessly, selling newspapers around the city and the streets, building demonstrations, building signs, organizing. That's why people join socialist and communist movements. It gives them that sense of being, that sense of purpose in their life. That's the strength of socialism. When people are loyal to socialism and communism, it is because it gave them this feeling. It's because it enabled them to do these kinds of things, to build things, to construct things, to feel part of a team, to work for a purpose, to live for something. That's the strength of socialism. When socialism does this, that's when people like it. That's why people love it. It's these kinds of accomplishments, this kind of mindset that gives socialism its power, that gives socialism a good name. But folks, at risk of offending some of my fellow tankies, I'm going to go here. When people feel negatively about socialism and communism, and yes, there are exaggerations out there. Yes, every allegation against socialism and communism is blown up bigger by opponents of communism. But when people feel negatively about socialism and communism, what kind of things do they talk about? Well, great example is the Cultural Revolution in China. It was an awful experience. The teenagers of China were mobilized to go through China trying to overthrow their parents, and breaking things, smashing ancient temples, destroying things, tearing things down, beating up teachers, beating up people accused of not being loyal enough to Mao. It was an atmosphere of destruction. It was an atmosphere of vengeance. It was awful. When people feel negatively about communism, they associate the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution is something that makes people feel very negative about communism. In fact, it's very likely that if Deng Xiaoping had not come to power and ended the Cultural Revolution, that communism and the Communist Party might have been thrown out in China, because so many intellectuals and smart people lived in absolute terror because of the Cultural Revolution. Or you can talk about the Great Fear, the Great Terror, Yezhov-Shina, 1936, 1937. And yes, even the most ardent defender of Stalin will tell you that was a bad time. People were turning in their neighbors. The secret police was arresting people. People were sent to gulags to do forced labor and be miserable. The Great Terror, Yezhov-Shina, was an awful time. It was an atmosphere of fear. It was an atmosphere of terror. It was an atmosphere of punishment. People taking revenge, accusing each other of being fascist spies, being conspirators, of not really being loyal enough to the party. The Great Terror is a dark memory in the history of the Soviet Union, a dark memory in the history of communism and socialism. Furthermore, 1871, The first time Marxists and socialists and communists ever took power, 1871. They seized control of Paris, the Paris Commune. Very famous. It's not famous to non-communists. It gets kind of glossed over by major historians. But for those of us who understand the history of Marxism, the Paris Commune is remembered as a very pivotal moment in the history of the world, the first time the working class took power. What had happened was that Prussia, the Prussian Empire, and France were having a war. The French capitalist government surrendered, but the workers of Paris did not want to be colonized and taken over by the Germans, so they formed a working class government, the Paris Commune. And the Paris Commune of 1871 took power, and briefly, for 2 months, there was a Marxist, socialist, revolutionary government in Paris. And what was one of the first things that the Paris Commune of 1871 did? Right? They replaced the police with a community militia. That's true. They granted women the right to vote. They offered protections for workers on the job. They sent up hot air balloons to spread revolutionary communist propaganda throughout France. But what was one of the other things they did? What was one of the first things that the revolutionary government of Paris, the Paris Commune of 1871, the government that Karl Marx said was storming heaven, what was one of the first things they did? They had a ceremony, and they burned the guillotine. Now, you know what the guillotine was? It was the head-chopping device that they used during the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, to behead people. It was a symbol of terror. It was a symbol of repression. It was a symbol of torture. It was a symbol of cruelty, right? You think that image of crowds of people who gathered in Paris, and would be cheering as someone's head would be removed from their body. It was like a show. And 1871, the communists took power. They burned the guillotine. They destroyed it. Because that memory of the French Revolution and the reign of terror associated with the French Revolution was something that they wanted to erase, right? When people don't like revolutions and don't like leftism and don't like socialism, what do they think of? They think of things like the reign of terror, guillotines. They think of gulags. They think of the Cultural Revolution. They think of firing squads. They think of political repression. I mean, let's be honest. Let's be honest, right? The aftermath of the Cuban Revolution, right? There were a lot of executions that went on. A lot of people from the old government were put to death. And that period is not remembered very fondly by many Cubans, right? Yes, their desire for revenge against the evil U.S.-backed dictatorship of Batista was unleashed. But there was an atmosphere of anger and revenge in the air, and people don't remember that very positively. The aftermath of the Iranian Revolution was very similar. Lots of executions of people associated with the Shah and his regime. They would show their dead bodies on the news to prove they were dead. People don't remember that time in Iran very well. Maybe they like the revolution. Maybe they think the Islamic Revolution did great things. But that moment, when every night it seemed that the news camera was panning over another corpse, that's not remembered very well. Folks, there is a reason that Trotsky betrayed the Soviet Union and Stalin was seen as the man who could lead the Soviet Union. There's a reason that the Soviet working class, the Soviet population overall, favored Stalin over Trotsky. And the reason is quite obvious and simple. The platform of Trotsky, after the death of Lenin, was the platform of permanent revolution, meaning that the Soviet people would be put into the military, and the Soviet Union would try to spread communism all over the world in a permanent revolution. There would never be peace until global communism had been achieved. The Soviet society would simply be militarized as a seized, liberated territory in a global crusade to behead every last king, every last priest, every last monarch, every last capitalist, until heaven on earth was achieved with bloodshed. That was Trotsky's platform. What was Stalin's platform? Stalin said socialism in one country. He said, we've driven out the invaders, the 15 countries that invaded us. Now we need to focus on coming together as a country, on building and constructing. We need to have a centrally planned economy, and we need to bring in technicians from the United States and from Britain and from France to do it. Right? Stalin imported Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers. That guy was a raging right-wing anti-communist, but Stalin paid him to get the Soviet oil industry going. Right? Stalin brought in technicians from all over the world, and Stalin was focused not on spreading communism all over the world, not on bloodshed and terror, but on industrializing the Soviet Union. Socialism in one country. And of course, the Russian people overwhelmingly favored socialism in one country and rejected permanent revolution. There's a reason for this, folks. I can give other examples, right? You listen to the old Soviet anthem, at least the English translation of the old Soviet anthem, right? I'm sure the words are very different in Russian. But the Paul Robeson American translation of the Soviet national anthem, one of the verses goes, "Through days dark and stormy, when great Lenin led us." Why was that time considered dark and stormy? Well, that was the aftermath of the Bolshevik seizure of power, when 15 different countries invaded the Soviet Union, when people were miserable and starving, when there were blockades to prevent food and medicine from getting into the country, when a lot of people were executed. A lot of people were executed in the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Churches were destroyed, right? That's that period, right? Was associated, and that's even still today. In Russia, Stalin is far more popular than Lenin. Communists like Lenin, sure. But if you're not a communist, the chances are you might like Stalin. You definitely don't like Lenin. Because Lenin's time in power is associated with mass executions. It's associated with civil war and death and destruction. What is going on here? There's a pattern here, folks. I'm trying to tell you that there's a pattern here. The things people like socialism for have one quality to them. And the things that people hate socialism for have another quality to them. And this points to the essence of the problem we are living in. This points to the essence of the synthetic left. This points to what I've been trying to tell you for so long. There's a certain theme here. There's a certain commonality to these examples I am giving you that will help you understand why there is a synthetic left and why there is a real left. There are two different souls within the communist spirit. There are two different psychologies within the Marxist movement. And who better to talk about psychology with than old Sigmund Freud, right? I'm sure a lot of people hate Sigmund Freud, and he's actually quite hateable, and I don't agree with him on many, many, many things. But old Sigmund Freud wrote this book. I believe it was his last book, Civilization and Its Discontents. The synthetic left folks love Sigmund Freud, by the way. The Frankfurt School, they love Sigmund Freud. They're all about combining Freudianism and Marxism, right? Now, the Soviet Union, they embraced Freud somewhat. Sabina Spielrein was someone who was in Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud's inner circle. She eventually became a very famous Soviet psychologist. Psychoanalysis went on within the Soviet bloc, but there was criticism of it. There was a lot of Marxist criticism of psychoanalysis. This is Sigmund Freud's last book, Civilization and Its Discontents. It was published in 1930. And in this book, Sigmund Freud points to a couple things that are very, very relevant to our conversation. The beginning, he begins the book, it's a short book, it's like an essay. He begins the book by talking about people he knows who are religious. Sigmund Freud was an atheist. And he describes this feeling that his religious friends have that he cannot relate to. He does not understand it. He writes about, referring to his religious friend, that he has a peculiar feeling. This, he says, consists of a peculiar feeling, which he himself is never without, which he finds confirmed by many others, and which he may suppose is present in millions of people. It is a feeling which he would like to call a sensation of eternity, a feeling as if something limitless, unbounded, as if it were oceanic. This feeling, he adds, is a purely subjective fact, not an article of faith. It brings with it no assurance of personal immortality. It brings with it, but it is the source of the religious energy which is seized upon by various churches and religious systems, directed by them into a particular channel, and doubtless also exhausted by them. One may, he thinks, rightly call oneself religious on the grounds of this oceanic feeling, even if one rejects every belief and every illusion. He's describing how religious people have this feeling of being part of eternity. He describes it as a sensation of eternity, a feeling of something limitless, unbounded, as if it were oceanic. Right? Later, he describes this same feeling that he observes from people who are religious that Sigmund Freud, of course, cannot relate to. He says, I can imagine that the oceanic feeling became connected with religion later on. The oneness with the universe, which constitutes its ideational content, sounds like a first attempt at a religious consolation, as though it were another way of disclaiming the danger which the ego recognizes as threatening it from the external world. He's talking about this emotional feeling that people who are religious, or maybe not religious, part of mass movements, part of a community dedicated to fighting for a cause, feel. Freud, being a selfish asshole, can't understand it, right? We know that Sigmund Freud was not a particularly nice person. He can't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to him. But all of his clients who are religious, they just get this feeling of joy, this feeling of being eternal, this feeling of being bigger than themselves from being religious. He just can't understand it. So he goes on in his essay to say that this must be left over from primitive man, right? This must be, we evolved from lower animals, he says, and this must be a leftover sentiment from some primitive early instinct, right? This must be something left over from the animal kingdom, right? That ants don't have a sense of individuality. They think as a collective. Termites think as a collective, right? Wolves in a pack. He thinks that this primitive feeling of kind of giving up one's ego and being part of something bigger than themselves, he says this must be a primitive state of being, and that part of humans evolving and becoming more civilized is giving up that feeling. But wait till what he says later. Later, Sigmund Freud is starting to explain what civilization is. And he realizes that part of what being civilized means is that one imposes restrictions on one's impulses. This is what he writes. He says, the liberty of the individual is no gift to civilization. The development of civilization imposes restrictions on it, and justice demands that no one shall escape those restrictions. What makes itself felt in a human community as a desire for freedom may be a revolt against some existing injustice, and so may prove favorable to the further development of civilization. It may remain compatible with civilization, but it may also spring from the remains of their original personality, which is still untamed by civilization, and thus may become the basis in them for hostility towards civilization, and is directed against particular forms and demands of civilization or against civilization altogether. It does not seem as though any influence could induce a man to change his nature into a termite's. A good part of the struggles of mankind center around the single task of finding an expedient accommodation, one, that is, that will bring happiness between this claim of the individual and the cultural claims of the group. And one of the problems that touches the fate of humanity is whether such an accommodation can be reached by means of some particular form of civilization, or whether this conflict is irreconcilable. Right? But he says, the most important of all, it is impossible to overlook the extent to which civilization is built upon the renunciation of instinct. How much it presupposes precisely the non-satisfaction, by suppression, repression, or some other means, of powerful instincts. This cultural frustration dominates the large field of social relationships of human beings. As we already know, it is the cause of the hostility against which all civilizations have to struggle. It will also make severe demands on our scientific work, and we shall have much more to explain here. So in essence, what Sigmund Freud is arguing is that civilization exists because people conform to the group. Right? Why am I wearing clothing right now? Right? Why am I not naked right now? Why do I not walk around the streets naked? That may be, I don't have any desire to do so, but if I did, I couldn't do it. If my instinct told me I could run around naked, I couldn't do it, or I would go to jail. That would be indecent exposure. Why? Because civilization restrains my instinct. Right? Civilization is about restraining people's impulses, getting people to conform to the group, getting people to control themselves, getting people to restrain their inner impulses is the basis of civilization. If everyone just did whatever they wanted, you would have no civilization. Right? Civilization is built on people restraining their impulses, built on them following rules, built on them exercising self-control. That's the basis of human civilization. That is the basis of human civilization. People restraining themselves for a higher purpose. What Freud is realizing here is that we all have desires, impulses, feelings that we restrain as a compromise with society. Right? You might have a boss at work you don't like. But can you tell that boss to go F themselves? Of course you can't, because then you would lose your job. So you restrain your angry impulse. Even though you're angry at your boss, you do your job. You know, you may have a sexual desire for someone, but they may not return that sexual desire. So, of course, you cannot continue to advance on them because that constitutes sexual assault. That constitutes sexual harassment. Right? You can't just do whatever you feel like doing because that involves a violation of other people. Right? Other people are respected. We have a social contract. And the social contract we have today is a lot looser than it once was. Look at feudalism, the system of feudalism. The social contract under feudalism was a lot stricter. Right? Peasants could be executed for looking their landlord in the face. They had to grovel when they saw their landlord or their noble. People could be killed. People were routinely burned at the stake for denying the existence of God. There was a very, very strong social contract. And the capitalist revolutions that overturned feudalism and brought socialism into existence were largely made by tapping into people's impulses, by giving people permission to release impulses that they had previously restrained. Think about it. The French Revolution. You have all these peasants who've been walking around being told that they have to obey their natural superiors. Their natural superiors get to eat the food that they grow. If there's a famine, their natural superiors still get to eat, and they starve to death. You have a church that backs all this up, and the Catholic Church reinforces the feudal hierarchy and says it's okay if you starve to death, because as long as you're a good, obedient little serf or peasant, when you die, you'll go to heaven, so you have to obey them. The Catholic Church is urging people to restrain their sexual impulses, urging people to just obey and restrain the rage and outrage and suffering that they feel at the hands of the feudal order. So the French Revolution comes along, and it overturns the feudal system. How does it do that? It unleashes people's rage, and it unleashes people's sexual impulses. Their rage is unleashed. All of a sudden, they're getting their revenge on those landlords who ate while they starved, who they weren't even allowed to look at in the face. They're dragging those landlords to the guillotine and chopping their heads off. And mobs are cheering as blood is gushing from a corpse, and they're getting their revenge. Their rage, all that rage that they've been suppressing for years, is coming out in an explosion called the Great Terror. And they just exterminate. They cut the throats of priests. They cut the throats of landlords and nobles. They execute the king. They execute Marie Antoinette. The Reign of Terror. In fact, they have this thing, the Committee on Public Safety, that is looking for people to execute. And at the same time, this accompanies an explosion of sexual release, right? Who's one intellectual who's very closely associated with the French Revolution? The Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade, who writes pornographic novels, and not just pornographic novels, novels depicting rape and torture of women. And these novels are selling all over France. And he begins his novels lecturing his readers about philosophy, saying that there is no morality, there is no God. He's a staunch atheist. And then from there, he launches into these really disgusting pornographic stories about women being raped and molested by priests, and sexual things being done with religious objects. That's the French Revolution. It is an explosion of rage at all the impulses, not all of them, but many of the impulses that feudal society was restraining. It is the rage and anger and aggression of the peasantry and the common people unleashed. It is the sexual impulses unleashed. In Marquis de Sade, we find sex and violence combined into this explosion of blood and gore. At one point, they want to execute Marquis de Sade. Instead, they just send him to a mental hospital. This is how the bourgeoisie came to power. The bourgeoisie came to power by renegotiating the social contract, by giving people permission to unleash impulses that they had previously restrained. The desire for vengeance, the desire for destruction, the desire to tear down and behead kings was unleashed by the capitalist class in order to take power. And to be fair, they gave us a much more restrained social contract. They gave us freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, kind of. They gave us freedom of the press, kind of. They gave us freedom of religion, kind of. I mean, we're a lot more free than we were under feudalism. That's a fact. It's not perfect, of course, but, there's plenty of hypocrisy, plenty of, we've talked about that before, but there's no question there's a higher level of social liberty than there was under feudalism. And this is how the entity that you can call the left learned to win politically. The left gave people permission to unleash their impulses. Right? The terms left and right go back to the French Revolution. After the king is forced down, the National Assembly is formed in Paris, and those who are more loyal to the king and feudalism sit on the right, and the radicals sit on the left. The left are the more in favor of tearing apart old social institutions, more in favor of breaking with tradition, more atheistic, more independent, more for social liberty, more for sexual liberty. That's the left. Meanwhile, the right are those trying the remnants of feudalism intact. That's the difference between the left and the right. And You go up to Marx's day. The left was always associated with unleashing restraints on impulses. Whereas the right is associated with that religious feeling that Sigmund Freud associates with, that oneness, that being part of an eternal community. It's the right that are associated with oneness, trying to uphold the remnants of feudalism, trying to uphold traditional religion, etc. It's the left that's associated with liberating people from restraining their impulses. And Marx is deeply influenced by that. Right? Karl Marx is deeply influenced by that. Marx first becomes a radical because he loves the French Revolution. He's in the cafes of Paris with the left Hegelians. That's where he meets Friedrich Engels. That is the left. The left becomes associated with unleashing people's desire for revenge, their desire to tear things apart, their desire to not be socially restrained, their desire to not be, controlled by a community, but instead their desire to tear things down, their desire to unleash their tapped up and pent up rage. All of this is what the left is associated with. Meanwhile, it's the right wing that are associated with patriotism and religion and tradition and oneness. Do it for not. If ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Right? This is the battle. The revolutionary is about unleashing the impulses. The conservative is about preserving tradition and achieving that oneness, that feeling of community. But wait a second. The Cold War comes along. And it all gets really confusing now, doesn't it? Doesn't it all get really, really confusing? Doesn't it all really, really perplex and confuse you now? Because now it doesn't make any sense. Especially in the 21st century, this doesn't make any sense. Because the communists, who took power in Russia and in China and in Cuba, everywhere, by unleashing people's desire for revenge against landowners and against the church and against the aristocracy, their rage, what makes the communists loved? What is it that people like about the communists? Their ability to create that magical feeling of oneness, the 5-year plans, community, comradeship, brotherhood, working for the good of the community, being part of a bigger project to save humanity, construction. People love communists for construction. Meanwhile, the ugly side of communism is what they originally took power on the basis of. Communists came to power on the basis of, we're going to tear things down, we're going to let you get revenge, we're going to tear apart feudal institutions, you're going to let your anger out, you're going to let your sexual desires out, we are going to come to power through the unleashing and the renegotiation of the social contract and the unleashing of your impulses. That's how the communists came to power. But everything that they did in that vein is associated with very, very negative feelings. Meanwhile, everything they did to create this oneness is associated with very, very good things. Are you seeing how weird this is getting? Now, enter the CIA. Right? Read about the Congress for Cultural Freedom. I've told you all about it before. The CIA, American intelligence, instead of trying to further restrain Americans' impulses, that's what the right wing was doing, right? You'll remember very famously that the Red Scare in the United States was also a huge crackdown on homosexuality, right? Joe McCarthy, they pushed a law that no gay person could work for the federal government because they might become a Soviet spy. There was a huge crackdown on pornography. That McCarthyism also accompanied a huge wave of social conservatism. The right wing, their attitude about how to fight communists is, we are going to be so militarized in America. We're going to be so patriotic in America that we're going to mobilize the country into a giant army and we're going to crush the communists. That's how fascists feel too. That was Hitler in Germany. That was Oswald Mosley in Britain. That was Benito Mussolini. Is that we are going to push this oneness to reinforce social hierarchy and authority and traditionalism in our society to crush the Reds. That's fascism. However, the CIA, the Rockefellers, the Congress for Cultural Freedom program have the opposite feeling. They say, look, the communists came to power by appealing to people's desire for revenge, by appealing to people's desire for the lifting of control on their impulses, for appealing to people's desire to be more individualist. Maybe we meaning Western capitalism, can hijack those feelings to no longer serve the communists, but instead to be utilized against them. And you'll notice that the Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe were quite conservative. Homosexuality was illegal in the Soviet Union. Abortion was illegal in the Soviet Union. They promoted the Soviet family. Mother, father, kids. There was a very socially conservative aspect to really existing socialism. Meanwhile, these feelings of total liberation and total individualism are much more compatible with Western capitalism. Hyper-individualism, as someone put in the chat, Ayn Rand. Right? Individualism above all else. Selfishness as a virtue. You are your own person. You have no loyalty or obligation to society. You are one person alone, and you should be able to do whatever you want. No one should be able to mess with you. You should be able to pursue your own interests however you want. That became the mantra of Western capitalism. Western capitalism suddenly began to champion the feelings that communists had previously utilized to take power. The desire for destruction. Look at the color revolutions, the statues coming down all across Eastern Europe. The feeling, the taking out and executing Ceausescu and government officials. All of the feelings that communists had utilized to take power became hijacked by Western capitalism. Meanwhile, the communists, in order to stay in power, what made them popular in the places where Marxist, communist, socialists are in power, is that feeling of oneness. That is what is loved about the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party gives people that feeling of oneness. They're loyal to China, a 5,000-year-old civilization. They are using socialism with Chinese characteristics to build up their country, to raise people out of poverty, to plan the economy. They represent a community that everyone is part of. The Chinese Communist Party gives people that religious feeling of oneness. Meanwhile, the Hong Kong protesters very much incarnate the desire to destroy, the desire to tear things down, the desire to be yourself and have your own individual life and not identify with a greater project. This is what's going on in our time. This is what has happened. The left and the right have gotten flipped in their psychological underpinnings. Not in what they believe. The ideology hasn't changed. Not in what they advocate. Advocacy hasn't changed. The psychological underpinnings that communists appeal to is that desire for oneness, that desire for community, that desire to build, to construct, to be part of something bigger than yourself. That's what communists appeal to. Meanwhile, it's Western capitalism that appeals to the releasing of impulses and individualism and the unleashing of the ego and the id. That's the difference. That's the strangeness of our times. That's why politics has gotten so weird and confusing lately. Okay? But I'll tell you why Sigmund Freud is wrong. And then I'll conclude. Sigmund Freud looks at this feeling of oneness, this community feeling, this feeling of immortality, this feeling of connection with things bigger than yourself. He looks at it with condescension, with, like, this is something left over. He says, he compares it to being a termite. Right? He sees it as primitive. He sees it as uncivilized. Meanwhile, he believes that further unleashing of social impulses will lead to a higher state of civilization. Here is what Sigmund Freud didn't understand. That feeling of oneness, that sense of community, that is the basis of social progress. That is the glue that holds civilizations together. That is not a primitive, barbaric way of being. That is the natural human state of being. And it has been the strength of that state of being that has enabled human beings to accomplish so much. It was a feeling of oneness that built the pyramids. It was a feeling of oneness that painted the Sistine Chapel. It's a feeling of oneness that enables an orchestra to perform a beautiful, beautiful symphony. It's a feeling of oneness with one's family, one's community. It brings happiness. And that trying to abolish that feeling of oneness isn't going to work. Furthermore, the reason that capitalism does not work is because of a lack of that feeling of oneness. Capitalism enables capitalists, owners of private means of production, to do whatever they feel is profitable, to work in their own profitable interest, to do whatever they want to do. So no obligation to society, no loyalty to the community, no personal project, no rational planning. Whatever a capitalist wants to do to make profits, they do it. That's why right now in the United States, our roads are not paved. Why? Well, no capitalist can make money from doing it. Right? That's why our water isn't being properly purified. That's why, at this point in the United States, we have some of the worst schools in the whole Western world. Look at our scores. We talk about Americans being dumb. We can't find our own country on a map. That's what this is about. Why should we do that? Everyone's doing their own thing, man. Everyone's fulfilling their own ego. The impulses are not being restrained. Everyone works in their own rational self-interest, and it just so happens that the richest of the rich always win. It's the law of the jungle. Morality and law exist for the purpose of protecting the weak from the strong. Without law, it becomes the law of the jungle. And the law of the jungle is might makes right. And when you strip away law, and morality and things like that, the richest of the rich, the most powerful, rule over the weakest, those without money, without any restraint. When the law stops, tyranny begins. Those words are on the walls of the U.S. Justice Department in Washington, D.C. When the law stops, tyranny begins. Without law, it is simply the rule of the rich and the powerful and the strong over those deemed to be weak. And that's what we very much have in the United States right now. We are a libertarian country. Capitalists make lots of profits. They buy off our politicians. They watch the country fall apart. The country is crumbling. They don't care. They make money. Right? They can't make money having people work in factories. That's okay. They make money by locking people in jail with their prison industrial complex. They make money off people, getting addicted to opioids. This is the situation we are in. The only way we can reestablish that feeling of oneness, that feeling of community, that happiness that so many people have gotten from socialism, not just through working to build their country and working under the leadership of a communist party, but being an activist, being part of a revolutionary socialist community, the only way that oneness can once again be achieved is through abolishing. The only way the United States can get out of this rut of capitalist profits run amok, of a small group of people getting rich by making the rest of the country and the rest of the world poor, the only way we can get out of that is to have socialism. The banks, factories, and industries, the major centers of economic power, must be in the hands of the people. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a central purpose in the United States. We need a community of people in the United States. We need a purpose for our lives. Why do you think so many young people are getting addicted to drugs or becoming depressed and becoming suicidal? What is that about? They don't have oneness in their lives. This feeling that Sigmund Freud scoffs at. Scoffs at it. Oneness. What is this? A feeling of eternity, like they're part of a community. He scoffs at it. What is this feeling he scoffs at? It's the basic human desire to be part of a community, to have a purpose, to not be on your own, to not be alone. And no, it's not going to be fulfilled by having access to pornography on your computer 24/7. It's not going to be fulfilled by being able to get high on marijuana. It's not going to be fulfilled by being able to get high on opioid drugs or be prescribed antidepressants to up your mood. It's not going to be fulfilled by that. This oneness, this oceanic feeling that Freud scoffs at, is a basic human need. People need a purpose in their lives. People need a value to live for. They need something that they can point to. They need community. They need solidarity. That's what they need. Communism, socialism, by abolishing capitalism, by having society itself control the means of production, achieves and maintains this feeling and allows human history and civilization to continue speeding ahead and moving forward. Meanwhile, capitalism, the unknown ideal of Ayn Rand, the belief that selfishness is a virtue, but compassion is weakness. It leads us further down the road to civilizational collapse and decay. But the synthetic left does not identify with oneness. They don't identify with community. They are continuing the belief that came out of the French Revolution, that leftism, revolutionary politics, socialism, shouldn't be about building or constructing. It should just continue this effort to lift social restraints, tear things down, give people more freedom, give people more permission to release their impulses, let people get their rage out, let people scream and yell, let people tear down things, let people accuse people of being racist, sexist, and homophobic, let people vent their rage, give people permission to be angry, give people permission to be sexual, give people permission to be lazy, give people permission to do all the things that society prefers. That's what they want leftist politics to be about. They see leftism as a movement to unleash impulses. And of course they hate existing socialist countries, because the strength of socialist countries is that feeling of oneness that they want to get rid of. Right? They hate Syria, they hate China, they hate Vietnam, they hate Korea, they hate Venezuela, because those societies are not sexual paradises. I just want to end by talking about Margaret Sanger. Do people know about Margaret Sanger? Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood. And she was a communist in New York City. She was a member of the Socialist Party. She was a funder of the industrial workers of the world. She was very excited about the Russian Revolution when it happened. She had her own magazine called Rebel Woman. But her focus was sex. It's about sex for her, right? And she fought heroically. Very heroically. For the right of women to use birth control. She sent birth control when it was illegal to send it through the mail, went to prison for doing, or got charged for doing so, fled the country. She was a socialist because socialists and communists were on the vanguard of fighting for women's rights to abortion and birth control. And she was all about that. She was about sexual freedom. However, the Soviet Union was about something different. She visited the Soviet Union in the 20s. It wasn't this free love paradise she wanted. Socialism didn't give the level of sexual freedom that she wanted, so she abandoned Marxism. She chucked it. She traded in socialism for sex. She made friends with John D. Rockefeller. They started paying her to open birth control and abortion clinics throughout the United States. She set up Planned Parenthood, first originally known as the Birth Control League. And she started hanging out with the Ku Klux Klan. And she realized that some more conservative Americans who were racist weren't going to agree with her about abortion and birth control on the basis of sexual freedom. So she started arguing, hey, we can use birth control to wipe out black people. Look this up. Look this up. She started arguing that you could use birth control to wipe out people she deemed to be of an inferior race. She threw down with the most vile racial supremacist forces because she wanted sex. Communism wasn't giving her the sexual freedom that she wanted. Capitalism could just as easily supply it. And racism became a key talking point in trying to convince people to legalize abortion and birth control. Margaret Sanger threw down with the Rockefellers. And the Rockefellers were all about sexual freedom. You know, they also funded the work of Alfred Kinsey. Right? You can read about the Kinsey Report. It was a best-selling book arguing for sexual freedom, sexual behavior of the human male, sexual behavior of the human female. Alfred Kinsey. It's been revealed that Alfred Kinsey collaborated with child molesters to do his sexual research. You can read the details, very disgusting. But regardless, you know, the Rockefellers understood that rather than trying to suppress feelings of individual, rather than trying to suppress people's instincts, you could beat the communists at their own game and hijack those feelings. And that's what imperialism has become. Liberalism now has the upper hand. Imperialism is waged in the name of liberalism, and there are a lot of confused people afraid of the New World Order that arose after the fall of the Soviet Union. That's what George Herbert Walker Bush called it. They're confused, ideologically confused. They don't know what they don't know what they believe. They don't know what to believe. They're trying to hold on to some beliefs from the past, a lot of beliefs that are very problematic and reactionary. What they're really trying to hold on to is a desire for that feeling of oneness. They got it from religion. They got it from their family. They got it from something, and they're trying to hold on to that feeling. And because the left has been hijacked by people that are trying to abolish that feeling, they don't know what to do. They have no idea where to turn. That's the confusion of our time. Well, the only way out of this is to reorient leftism, to build a socialism that gives people that feeling of oneness, a socialism that's not about tearing things down, a socialism that's about construction. How do we build a constructive socialism? How do we build a socialism that gives people a community to be part of? How do we build a socialism that's about building, not about tearing things down? How do we build a socialist community that empowers people and gives people hope and gives people that eternal feeling of being part of something bigger than themselves? How do we do that? That's what I'm trying to figure out. I hope that you will help me to figure it out. And that concludes my opening remarks. I hope you all enjoyed it.